Think about a time that you returned to a place as a teenager or an adult, somewhere that you had not been since you were a child, or somewhere that a good number of years had passed since you had been there last. Did you notice that the place shrank while you were gone? Seriously, though, it felt a lot smaller than it had the last time you were there. When people ask me where I grew up, I don't have a singular answer. As I perceived it, my childhood was pretty evenly split, and my response usually goes something like this. I spent the first half of my childhood in Pennsylvania, and we lived in Oaks, sort of near Philadelphia, where my dad was pastor at the Green Tree Church of the Brethren. The summer between 6th and 7th grade, my dad took a new pastorate, and we moved to Dayton, Virginia in the Shenandoah Valley. And that is where I spent the rest of my middle school and high school years, before coming to Elizabethtown College, and the rest is history. At some point as a late teen or young adult, my family returned to that childhood church for an event of some kind, probably a memorial service. And I specifically remember noticing how small the church building had become. From the outside, it looked normal. But once we got inside, the sanctuary was easily half the size that it had been when I was a child, and there were definitely fewer pews. The ceilings everywhere were lower, the hallways were narrower, the fellowship hall, I don't even understand how everyone fit in for Love Feast. It's a strange thing, experiencing something change seemingly in front of your eyes. I imagine it might have been a bit how the people of Judah felt. Last Sunday, when Isaiah 40:13 was selected for the preaching focus this morning, I made a comment to the effect of, "It's always Isaiah." To be clear, I have no beef with Isaiah. I was more reflecting on the sense that it seems like we hear about the book of Isaiah a lot. Certainly we hear about it at Advent, part of this text actually, although we don't necessarily spend a lot of time with it for its own sake. First, this book is really long. It's one of the longest in the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, although the ranking of length depends on whether you are counting pages, chapters, or verses, whether you're looking at an English translation or the original Hebrew, but in any case, it's pretty long. And we also see Isaiah used a lot in the New Testament. And there's good reason for that. As the early followers of Jesus were trying to figure out how to be in their world and how to understand the meaning of the story they were hearing about Jesus' life and death and resurrection, there was a lot of pointing back to the scriptures with which they were familiar, trying to put some pieces together, often finding some grounding and connection in Isaiah. And Isaiah, in providing a prophetic message of hope and comfort for a group of people emerging from significant existential crisis, more on that in a second, Isaiah is pointing forward, looking toward the future with expectation of restoration and healing. So there is some natural connection between the prophecy of hope and the promise found in Isaiah, and the theological meaning-making found in the Gospels, for example. A little bit about the book of Isaiah. This is classified as prophetic literature, and it probably contains contributions from more than one author or editor. Generally speaking, chapters 1 to 39 are attributed to the original Isaiah, Isaiah ben Amos, or Isaiah son of Amos, from the 8th century BCE. Where we find ourselves here in chapter 40 is the beginning of the second section of the book, attributed to second Isaiah, an unknown author writing about 2 centuries later in the 6th century BCE. But even though there may be several contributors to this text and several iterations of editing the content, scholars generally agree that the whole thing is presented with about the same tone and with the same overall message. As a prophet, Isaiah, and in this text, are seeking to bridge the gap between God and the people. Isaiah and other prophets served as messengers from God to the people, both conveying theological understanding, trying to figure out who and what God is, and also drawing attention to God's activity in the world at the time. In chapter 40 and beyond, the context is most likely responding to the return of ancient Israel, who become known as the Jewish people, to their homeland. And I don't think we can talk about it without looking at the historical context, so I'll try to give you the short version. Early in the 6th century BCE, the Babylonians and their king, Nebuchadnezzar, also of Daniel and the Lion's Den fame, conquered Jerusalem, which was at that point the capital of the kingdom of Judah. Over the course of 2 waves, many Judahites, but probably not all, were taken away and exiled in Babylon for about 50 or 60 years. In 539 BCE, King Cyrus of Persia conquered Babylon, which effectively ended the exile period. Isaiah and other scriptural writings provide a theological witness to historical events, demonstrating how all these events are part of God's plan, show God's power, and continue to encourage hearers and readers to remember God's investment in Israel, the restoration of Zion, or Jerusalem, and ultimately a more long-term vision of peace and strength for the war-torn and the weak. All of that could be a whole separate sermon. For now, I just want to focus on this passage in Isaiah 40, from verses 12 through to the end of the chapter. Imagine, if you will, the exiled Judahites returning to Jerusalem. And if 50 or 60 years have passed, we're probably talking about the next generation or 2 after those who were originally taken away. We're probably not talking about many people who have any actual memory of Jerusalem, but they've heard about it from their parents, their grandparents, their friends. Or if they have a memory, it's been a really, really long time. Things have probably changed pretty significantly. It seems the end of the exile was in sight, but to what would the people be returning? Jerusalem, the temple, destroyed. It was not going to be the same city that they remember or had heard about. Lives have moved on. Births, deaths, families and societies growing and changing. 60 years is a long time. Some probably felt Babylon wasn't that bad and would choose to stay where a new life had been established. Others would bring some of Babylon back to Jerusalem with them, whether they realized it or not. Still others might attempt to recreate the original Jerusalem that they had heard about, denying the passage of time and determined that this was the promise that restoration would look like. Let's go back to my return to my childhood church. In addition to the things I described inside the church building, there was another noticeable shrinkage or change. The parking lot seemed smaller. Now, you might not think that the parking lot would be something I would pay a whole lot of attention to since I was 12 when we left and I wasn't driving a car yet, but there's a reason why it was important to me. We lived in the parsonage, and the way the properties were laid out, behind our backyard was the parking lot, and then across the parking lot to one side was the church. And across the parking lot, all the rest of the way around was nothing. I remember a large area that had not been paved, full of gravel and Queen Anne's lace and goldenrod, and then just a great expanse of fields. At that time, in the early and mid-'80s, there just wasn't much around. The parking lot was fairly freshly paved in those days, with bright white parking space lines neatly painted across smooth black asphalt, shimmering and softening a bit in the hot summer sun. In my memory, I spent a lot of time riding around that nice, smooth parking lot on my bike. I imagined that each lined-off parking space was a house, and I would visit the people that I imagined lived in each spot. And I would bike down the roads or the parking lot aisles from one house to another. At night, it was quiet, and it was dark, and stars were visible everywhere. On at least one July 4th, we set up lawn chairs out in that rocky, weedy area in the dark and could see fireworks in multiple spots around the horizon. That parking lot fueled my imagination, at least in part due to its expansive and open nature. That's not the case today. During the 90s, all that open space and those fields became too valuable for developers to pass up. And by the time we were back to visit several years later, developments had invaded and houses had been built all around that church parking lot with shrubs installed as buffer. And the parking lot suddenly felt very small. It happens. Growth and change is normal and natural and comes along with the passage of time. It's often subtle. Growing and changing is not as noticeable when we are in regular daily contact with one another, but time and distance provide space for contrast. I might not notice how my own children have grown and changed as we move along through the rhythm of daily life, except for the momentous moment when one of them realizes they have surpassed in height someone else in the household. But when we see our niece or nephew, or when you see a grandchild or a neighbor who's gone off to college after some time has passed, we notice how they have grown so tall, or their hair color has changed, or even things we can't quite put into words, the way they carry themselves, the manner in which they speak, the way they smile is different somehow. It can be unsettling. But Isaiah is here to say that even in the midst of all this reestablishment and shifting and uncertainty that's on the horizon, don't forget what you already know. Don't forget God is active in the world, God is big, and God is with you, and God is with us. Some of these descriptors are challenging for us to really fathom. Indescribable, really. Or we've heard them so many times, they start to lose meaning. Maybe we're just not feeling it. Maybe Isaiah here is prompting a prophetic instruction to pay attention. I spent a little bit of time this week reading some of Barbara Brown Taylor's book, An Altar in the World, which I had read before and came back to. If you are not familiar with her work, I invite you to check it out. Vulnerable and honest and humorous and sometimes a little feisty. Barbara Brown Taylor writes of reverence, the act of paying attention to something bigger, outside of ourselves, which enables connectedness to creation and each other. I would love to read this whole book to you, but I don't think any of us have that scheduled in our day, so I will just share a couple of paragraphs. Barbara Brown Taylor writes, "The easiest practice of reverence I know is simply to sit down somewhere outside, preferably near a body of water, and pay attention for at least 20 minutes. It is not necessary to take on the whole world in this time. Just take the 3 square feet of earth on which you are sitting, paying close attention to everything that lives within that small estate. You might even decide not to kill anything for 20 minutes, including that salt marsh mosquito that lands on your arm. Just blow her away and ask her to please go find someone else to eat. With any luck, you will soon begin to see the souls in pebbles, ants, small mounds of moss, and the acorn on its way to becoming an oak tree. You may feel some tenderness for the struggling mayfly the ants are carrying away. If you can see the water, you may take time to wonder where it comes from and where it is going. You may even feel the beating of your own heart, that miracle of ingenuity that does its work with no thought or instruction from you. You did not make your heart any more than you made a tree. You are a guest here. You have been given a free pass to this modest domain and everything in it. If someone walks by or speaks to you, you may find that your power of attentiveness extends to this person as well. Even if you do not know him, you may be able to see his soul too, the one he thinks he is so carefully covering up. There is something he is working on in his life, the same way you are working on something. Can you see it in his face? You are related, even if you do not know each other's names. Isaiah reminds us that it's not about us. It's not about what we have created, but it's about how we fit into God's much larger creation. It's not about the way we determine governance and nation and sovereignty in this world, because God is both all over and over all of that. This was true for those exiled to Babylon. The prophetic writing is assuring those in exile that this is not the last word, and God's promises and hope have not been forgotten. This is particularly challenging in our society today, where being self-made and self-promoting is the name of the game. I wonder, have we brought that into the church, too? Are we more attentive to how we do things here in this space than how we carry the essence of this out there during the rest of the week? Have we built walls and ceilings around our interpretation of God that have become a little small, that feel a tad snug? Perhaps this text from Isaiah is also a prophetic prompt to practice. How do we possibly buy into the idea that God is so powerful, and yet we see so much pain and suffering all around us? How do we even make sense of these descriptors of the grandeur of God? What if we see God, catch glimpses of God and God's character, not solely by hearing the words, but by experiencing them, practicing our faith through our relationship with one another, providing care, meals, childcare, lawn mowing, conversation, through worshiping together, prayer, singing, praise, confession, through studying the sacred text and discerning together, and laughter, through forgiveness and learning and washing feet and giving. In these ways and others, we catch glimpses of God at work, and over time, maybe a lifetime, we begin to gain deeper understanding of God's ways, even if we are challenged to put them into words. Years, a lifetime of paying attention to God's activity in the world in ways that we interpret as grand theological gestures, and also in the delicate, fascinating movement of the grasshopper's jaws. Listening to prophetic voices, and sometimes speaking as one on God's behalf. Posturing oneself with humility, and also stepping out empowered, which seems like a yo-yo. Doing all of that over and over and over again, and we start to catch glimpses that affirm and describe God's presence and power in ways that no words can. peace, service, and openness to all. Less a descriptor of who this congregation is, perhaps, and more the continual practices with which we must engage, through which we hope to catch glimpses of an indescribable and incomprehensible God at work in this world, in these people. Times are changing. In the context of this second part of the book of Isaiah, the people have been in exile, taken from their land, their familiar, and they are reassessing what life looks like in a new place with a new way of doing things. Even though it is good news, it is still nerve-wracking. It's different. We have been exiled. I mean, we were literally pushed out of this space and all of our other normal social routine spaces for months. There are still some who are not able to return yet. And here's what happens when you go back. It's not the same. It wasn't the same for the Judahites when they returned from Babylon. It wasn't the same when you returned to that place as a teenager or adult that you had been as a child. It's not going to look the same as it used to because moment to moment, it never does. The community changes as the circumstances of individual lives change. Perhaps Isaiah provides us some assurance that this is not news to God. God doesn't even look the same sometimes. The people's story of God, the people's understanding of God, our understanding of God shifts and changes and grows and expands as we continue to pay attention and practice. And the church, capital T, capital C, writ large, the worldwide worshiping Christian community is changing. Other faith traditions as well that recognize the sacred in many forms are changing. And our congregation here at the corner of Mount Joy and Cedar Streets in Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania, is changing. And yet, don't forget, God is active in the world. God is big, and God is with you, and God is with us. And in order to remember that, to really feel that as more than just words on a page in an old ancient text, and more than nice things we hear in a song, and words that a pastor speaks from a microphone in front of a group on a Sunday morning, we need to pay attention and practice. And that's what makes it real. It is in the act of paying attention and the act of practice living faithfully that we meet God and we meet each other. And so we find ourselves at the end of Isaiah chapter 40. But for those who live in these ways, those who wait, those who are patient, those who pay attention, those who practice, and especially those who are weak and powerless, they will receive fresh strength, moving in the world with new energy, surprising stamina, and maybe even some of God's creativity and imagination for the journey ahead. May it be so.